The old stone church on Maple Street had been empty for 23 years when Sarah Martinez handed over her last $15,000 in cash. 8 months pregnant and desperate to escape the violence that had claimed her boyfriend's life, she saw salvation in those crumbling walls. The realtor seemed eager to close quickly, almost too eager. Sarah didn't care. She just needed somewhere safe to raise her baby. But on her first night inside, a loose floorboard near the altar gave way under her weight. What she found in the hidden chamber below would shatter everything she thought she knew about this quiet town. Stacks of police files marked missing lined the walls, photographs of faces that had vanished without a trace, and evidence that pointed to a conspiracy reaching the highest levels of local government. Sarah had bought this church to hide from danger, but she'd unknowingly placed herself at the center of the town's darkest secret. The question wasn't whether she could expose the truth, it was whether she'd survive long enough to do it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The musty air hit Sarah's face as she descended into the darkness, her phone's flashlight cutting through shadows that seemed to resist the light. Her heart hammered against her ribs, the baby shifting restlessly as if sensing her fear. The chamber stretched further than she'd expected, carved from the bedrock beneath the church foundation. The files were organized with military precision. Dozens of manila folders, each containing photographs, witness statements, and official police reports spanning 3 decades. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the first folder. A young woman named Jessica Torres, 19, last seen leaving her job at the local diner in 1994. The police report was thin, barely 2 pages, but the handwritten notes tucked behind it told a different story. Subject knew too much about Councilman Bradley's activities. Relocation necessary. Relocation, not murder, not disappearance. The clinical language made Sarah's stomach turn. She flipped through more files, each one revealing the same pattern. People who'd gotten too close to something, who'd asked too many questions, who'd threatened the careful order that someone worked very hard to maintain. The photographs on the walls were worse. Surveillance shots of ordinary people going about their daily lives, unaware they were being watched. Teachers, shop owners, teenage kids. Red X's marked through at least half of them. At the far end of the chamber, a map of the town covered the stone wall, marked with colored pins and dates. Maple Street, where she now stood, was circled in thick red marker. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Welcome to Millbrook, Miss Martinez. Hope you're settling in well." Her blood turned to ice. She'd been in town less than 48 hours. Hadn't given her number to anyone except the realtor and the utility company. The baby kicked hard, as if urging her to run, but where could she go? She'd spent everything on this place, and her Honda barely had enough gas to make it to the next town. Another file caught her eye, this one marked with yesterday's date. Inside she found copies of her own identification, bank records, and a photograph taken through her car window as she'd signed the church papers. A yellow sticky note was attached, pregnant. Handle with care. Standard protocol may not apply. Standard protocol. Sarah thought of Jessica Torres, of all those faces marked with red X's. She thought of Marcus, gunned down in their apartment doorway because he'd witnessed something he shouldn't have. She'd fled to this sleepy town believing she was escaping violence, only to discover she'd walked directly into its source. The sound of footsteps above made her freeze. Slow, deliberate steps moving across the church floor, heading toward the altar. She quickly switched off her phone's flashlight and pressed herself against the stone wall, praying the darkness would hide her. "Sarah?" A man's voice called out, friendly and concerned. "Miss Martinez, I saw your lights on and wanted to check if everything was all right." She recognized the voice from earlier that day. Chief of Police William Bradley, the same name she'd seen mentioned in half a dozen files. He'd stopped by to welcome her to the neighborhood, all warm smiles and small-town charm. Now his voice carried a different undertone, something that made her skin crawl. "Sarah, I know you're here. Your car's outside, and these old floors tell stories. Why don't you come up so we can talk? I think there might be some things about your new home that you need to understand." The footsteps moved closer to the broken floorboard. In a few moments, he'd discover the entrance to the chamber. Sarah looked around desperately, spotting a narrow passage leading deeper into the underground space. Without hesitation, she crept toward it, one hand protecting her belly, the other clutching the files that might be the only evidence of decades of buried truth. Behind her, she heard Chief Bradley's sharp intake of breath as he discovered what lay beneath his town's most sacred ground. The church looked even more desolate in daylight than it had during her first visit. Sarah pulled her worn jacket tighter against the October wind as she stood before the heavy oak doors, keys cold in her palm. 3 days had passed since she'd signed the papers, 3 days of sleeping in her car and rationing the granola bars that comprised her remaining food supply. The realtor had seemed almost relieved when she'd appeared with cash, asking no questions about the building's history or why such a beautiful structure sat abandoned for over a decade. "Structural issues," he'd muttered, avoiding her eyes. Previous owners had difficulties with the property. Now, pushing open the doors that groaned like wounded animals, Sarah wondered what difficulties he'd meant. The interior was a cavern of shadows and dust motes dancing in colored light from stained glass windows. Pews sat in crooked rows, some overturned, others missing entirely. The air tasted of mold and something else, something metallic that made her stomach turn. She'd brought supplies from the dollar store, a battery-powered lantern, cleaning products, a sleeping bag, and enough canned food to last a week. The baby had been restless all morning, pressing against her ribs as if sensing her anxiety. At 7 months, every movement felt like a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. The main sanctuary would need extensive work, but it could wait. Her immediate priority was finding a small area she could make livable, somewhere warm and dry where she could set up a temporary shelter until she figured out her next move. The rectory behind the altar seemed promising, though the door was locked and none of her keys fit. As afternoon faded to evening, Sarah had managed to clear enough debris from a corner near the altar to spread her sleeping bag. The battery lantern cast a circle of yellow light that made the shadows beyond seem even darker. She was heating a can of soup on her portable camping stove when she heard the first sound, a low thump from somewhere beneath her feet. Sarah froze, spoon halfway to her mouth. Old buildings settled, she told herself, especially old buildings with structural problems. But the sound came again, deliberate, rhythmic, like someone walking. She grabbed the lantern and moved toward the altar, following the sound. The footsteps, if that's what they were, seemed to be coming from directly below the raised platform. Sarah had noticed the altar was oddly positioned, set back farther than typical church architecture would suggest, but now she realized there might be a reason. Running her hands along the base of the platform, she found what felt like a seam in the wood. Her fingers traced its outline until she located a small depression that gave way under pressure. A section of the platform shifted with a grinding sound, revealing a narrow opening and stone steps descending into darkness. The smell that rose from below was overwhelming, earth and decay, and that same metallic tang she'd noticed earlier. Sarah's instinct screamed at her to replace the panel and pretend she'd never found it. But she needed to know what was down there, needed to understand what she'd bought with her last $3,000. The stone steps were worn smooth by countless feet. Her lantern beam revealed rough walls that looked much older than the church above. After descending about 15 steps, she found herself in a small chamber carved directly from the bedrock. What she saw made her legs buckle. The walls were covered with photographs, hundreds of them, pinned and taped and tacked to every available surface. Men, women, children, all smiling at the camera with the frozen happiness of school portraits and family snapshots. But these weren't family photos. Each picture had a date written across the bottom in red ink, spanning decades. Some were yellowed with age, others looked recent enough to have been printed yesterday. In the center of the chamber sat a metal table covered with manila folders. their contents spilling out in organized chaos. Sarah approached with trembling hands and opened the nearest file. Inside were newspaper clippings about a missing college student from 1987, police reports marked with official stamps, and handwritten notes in margins that spoke of containment and necessary measures. Another folder contained similar materials for a different person, a businessman who'd disappeared in 1995. Another held documents about a family of 4 who'd vanished while camping in 2003. Each file was meticulously organized, each disappearance thoroughly documented, and each marked with the same red stamp, resolved. The baby kicked hard, as if trying to wake her from a nightmare, but Sarah knew she wasn't sleeping. She was standing in a tomb of secrets, surrounded by the faces of people who'd been erased from existence. And somewhere in this underground chamber was evidence of who had taken them and why. Her hands shook as she reached for another folder, this one marked with last month's date. Inside was a photograph of a young woman with dark hair and frightened eyes, standing in front of a building Sarah recognized immediately. She was looking at the church above her head. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke as Maya stood in the doorway of her newly purchased church, watching sheets of rain pummel the overgrown cemetery beyond. Thunder rolled across the valley, and she instinctively placed a protective hand over her growing belly. At 22 weeks, the baby had started moving regularly, little flutters that reminded her why she'd spent every last dollar on this crumbling sanctuary. She'd been living in the church for 3 days now, sleeping on an air mattress in what used to be the vestry, surviving on canned soup and crackers from the general store in town. The electricity worked sporadically, and the plumbing was a prayer away from complete failure, but it was hers. No landlords demanding rent she couldn't pay, no eviction notices, no strange men following her home from her old job at the diner. A particularly violent crack of thunder shook the building, and Maya noticed something odd. The sound seemed to echo strangely, as if the building were larger than it appeared. She'd explored most of the church already, the main sanctuary with its broken pews and stained glass windows, the small vestry, a storage closet filled with mouldering hymnals. But that echo suggested spaces she hadn't found. Lightning illuminated the sanctuary in stark white flashes as Maya made her way toward the altar. The wooden structure was massive, clearly built to be permanent rather than decorative. As she ran her hands along its base, searching for the source of the strange acoustics, her fingers found something unexpected, a seam in the wood that didn't match the grain. Another flash of lightning revealed what her hands had discovered, a panel that looked like it might move. Maya pressed against it experimentally, and with a soft click, a section of the altar's base swung inward on hidden hinges. Cold air rushed out, carrying the musty smell of long-enclosed spaces, and something else, the faint scent of old paper and dust. Maya's phone flashlight revealed stone steps descending into darkness. Her first instinct was to close the panel and pretend she'd never found it. She had enough problems without exploring mysterious underground chambers. But curiosity won. Keeping one hand on the wall for balance, she descended the narrow steps. The passage was older than the church above, carved from native stone and damp with decades of mountain moisture. After 12 steps, she emerged into a chamber that her phone's light couldn't fully illuminate. Finding a light switch on the wall, she flipped it hopefully. Ancient fluorescent bulbs flickered to life, revealing a room that made her stomach drop. The chamber was larger than the sanctuary above, with walls lined floor to ceiling with filing cabinets, boxes, and bulletin boards covered in photographs and documents. But it wasn't an ordinary storage room. It was someone's obsessive workspace. Maps covered one entire wall, marked with red pins and string connecting various locations. Newspaper clippings were tacked everywhere, their headlines speaking of missing persons, unsolved disappearances, and families searching for lost loved ones. Maya approached one of the bulletin boards, her heart racing. The photographs showed dozens of people, men, women, teenagers, even children. Each photo was accompanied by dates, locations, and handwritten notes in a cramped, urgent script. Many of the dates went back 20, 30 years, some were more recent. A desk in the center of the room held stacks of files and a typewriter that looked like it belonged in a museum. Maya opened the nearest file with trembling hands. Inside were police reports, witness statements, and what appeared to be private investigation notes. The name on the file was Jennifer Mullins, age 17, disappeared June 3, 1998. She opened another file. David Chen, age 34, disappeared September 12, 2003. Another, the Morrison family, parents Sarah and Tom, children ages 8 and 11, disappeared August 25, 2010. Each file contained the same elements: official police reports that seemed to end abruptly, witness statements that had apparently been ignored, and extensive handwritten notes questioning the official conclusions. Maya's hands shook as she realized what she was looking at: evidence that someone had been tracking a pattern of disappearances that authorities had either missed or deliberately overlooked. The baby kicked hard, as if sensing her distress. Maya placed both hands on her belly, trying to calm herself and think rationally. Someone had been using this chamber as a base of operations to investigate disappearances spanning decades. The question was whether that person had been a crusading amateur detective trying to expose the truth, or something far more sinister. Thunder crashed overhead, and the lights flickered ominously. Maya grabbed the nearest file and headed for the stairs. She needed to get out of this chamber, needed air and space to think. But as she reached the bottom step, she heard something that made her blood freeze. Footsteps. Heavy boots walking across the sanctuary floor above. Someone else was in her church. The morning sun streamed through the cracked stained glass windows, casting fractured rainbows across the dusty pews. Sarah had barely slept, her mind replaying every detail of what she'd discovered beneath the altar. The manila folders lay spread across the front pew like tarot cards, revealing an unwanted future, each one containing a life that had simply vanished. She picked up the folder labeled Martinez Elena, age 19, and opened it again. The photograph showed a young woman with kind eyes and a hopeful smile, not unlike her own driver's license photo from better days. According to the handwritten notes, Elena had disappeared 3 years ago while working as a housekeeper for wealthy families in the hills above town. The official police report, attached with a rusty paperclip, concluded she had likely returned to Mexico voluntarily. But the unofficial notes told a different story. Someone had documented Elena's fear in the weeks before her disappearance, her claims that she did witnessed something she shouldn't have, her desperate attempts to find a way out of town. The final entry was dated 2 days before the official missing person report was filed. He agreed to testify. Scheduled to meet Detective Morrison tomorrow at 3 p.m. She never showed. Sarah's hands trembled as she set the folder aside and reached for another. Chen David, age 24, a graduate student at the local university who'd been researching water contamination in the industrial district. His thesis advisor reported him missing when he failed to attend his defense presentation. The police report suggested he'd suffered a nervous breakdown and left town. The hidden notes painted a picture of a young man who discovered something that powerful people wanted buried. A pattern emerged as she worked through the files. All the missing people had been asking questions, digging into things that made certain people uncomfortable, and Detective Morrison's name appeared in every single unofficial file. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if sensing her distress. Sarah rubbed her belly absently, trying to process what she'd stumbled into. Someone had been using this church as a private archive, documenting cases that the official system had dismissed or buried. But why? And where was this mysterious record keeper now? A car door slammed outside, the sound echoing through the empty church like a gunshot. Sarah's heart hammered as she quickly gathered the folders, looking for somewhere to hide them. The sound of footsteps on gravel grew closer, accompanied by muffled voices. "Sure, this is the place." A man's voice carried through the thin walls. "Deed was filed yesterday. Some pregnant girl bought it with cash." This voice was deeper, more authoritative. Probably just another squatter looking for free housing. Sarah crept toward the window, clutching the folders against her chest. Through the dirty glass, she could see two men standing beside a black sedan. One wore a police uniform, his face shadowed by the brim of his cap. The other was older, wearing an expensive suit that seemed out of place in this run-down neighborhood. "We need to make sure she didn't find anything," the man in the suit said. "Father Miguel was supposed to clean everything out before he left, but you know how he got toward the end. Paranoid, forgetful." The uniformed officer nodded. "What if she's already seen something? Then we handle it like we handled the others." Sarah's blood turned to ice water. She backed away from the window, her mind racing. Father Miguel must have been the one keeping the records, documenting the truth that others wanted hidden, and now these men were here to make sure his secrets stayed buried. The front door rattled as someone tested the handle. Sarah had left it unlocked, too distracted by her discovery to think about security. She heard the hinges creak as the door swung open. Moving as quietly as her pregnant body would allow, she slipped toward the back of the church, clutching the folders. There had to be another way out, maybe through the sacristy or a back door. The baby seemed to sense the danger too, settling into an ominous stillness. "Hello?" the police officer called out. "Anybody here? We just want to talk." Sarah reached the altar area and looked desperately for an escape route. The hidden chamber gaped open like a mouth, and she realized with horror that she'd left it exposed. The men would know immediately that someone had found Father Miguel's archive. Behind the altar, she spotted a narrow door marked sacristy. She tried the handle, locked. The footsteps were getting closer, their voices growing more urgent as they spotted evidence of her presence. "Someone's definitely been here," the suited man said, "and they found the chamber." Sarah pressed herself against the wall, folders clutched to her chest as the footsteps approached the altar. Her new safe haven had become a trap, and she was about to come face to face with the people responsible for all those disappearances. The baby kicked once, hard, as if to remind her that she wasn't just fighting for her own life anymore. The manila folders seemed to multiply before Sarah's eyes as she methodically went through each one. Missing persons dating back 30 years, all with similar patterns, vulnerable people who wouldn't be immediately missed. Runaways, addicts, the homeless, undocumented immigrants. Each file contained a photograph, basic information, and, most chillingly, handwritten notes tracking their movements and habits. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened another folder. Maria Gonzalez, 19, pregnant, last seen at a clinic downtown. The photo showed a young Latina woman with kind eyes and Sarah's own desperate expression. The date was only 8 months ago. A noise outside made Sarah freeze. The sound of gravel crunching under tires echoed through the church's broken windows. She quickly swept the files back into their box, her heart hammering against her ribs. The beam from her flashlight danced wildly as she tried to organize the evidence with shaking hands. Car doors slammed. Voices, low and urgent, drifted through the walls. Sarah clicked off her flashlight and crawled toward the chamber entrance, straining to hear. 2 men, maybe 3, were discussing something near the front of the building. She caught fragments. The property, someone's been inside, and worst of all, clean it out. They had keys. The sound of the front door opening sent ice through Sarah's veins. She was trapped in the hidden chamber with nowhere to run. The wooden steps above her head creaked as heavy footsteps moved across the sanctuary floor. "Looks like someone's been camping here," a gravelly voice said. "Sleeping bag, some cans. Probably just another vagrant. Boss wants everything moved tonight." Another voice replied, younger, nervous. "Says the new owner might start renovations soon." Sarah pressed herself against the cold stone wall, barely daring to breathe. The boxes around her suddenly felt like evidence of her own death sentence. These men weren't just cleaning up old files, they were eliminating witnesses to whatever had happened in this place. "Check the basement," the first voice ordered. "Make sure we didn't miss anything down there." Footsteps moved toward the back of the church. Sarah realized with growing horror that there might be another entrance to the chamber, one she hadn't discovered. She fumbled in the darkness for her backpack, stuffing the Maria Gonzalez file inside along with several others. If she was going to die here, someone needed to know what she'd found. A beam of light suddenly pierced the chamber from above. Sarah flattened herself behind a stack of boxes as the light swept across the space. "Just old church junk," the nervous voice called out. "Looks like it's been sealed up for years. Good. Let's get the important stuff and torch the rest." Torch. They were going to burn the church down with her inside. Sarah waited until the footsteps moved away before creeping toward the loose stone she'd entered through. The voices continued their conversation above, discussing accelerants and making it look like vandalism. She had maybe 10 minutes before they started the fire. The stone scraped softly as she pushed it aside. Sarah squeezed through the opening, backpack clutched against her chest. The basement was dark and silent, but she could still hear movement on the floor above. She felt her way along the wall toward where she remembered seeing stairs. Her foot hit something soft. Sarah bit back a gasp as her hands found fabric, then the unmistakable shape of a human body. It was fresh, still warm. She jerked her hand away and forced herself to keep moving, tears streaming down her face. The basement stairs were old and rotten. Sarah tested each step carefully, knowing that one loud creak would bring the men running. Above her, she could hear them moving boxes and discussing their cleanup operation with casual efficiency that spoke of long practice. She reached the basement door and slowly turned the handle. It opened onto a side yard she hadn't explored yet, hidden from view of the main entrance. Sarah slipped out into the night air, grateful for the cold wind against her face. The men's car was parked out front, a black SUV with tinted windows. Sarah circled wide around the building, staying low behind overgrown bushes and broken headstones. Her own car was hidden behind the church, but reaching it meant crossing open ground. She was halfway to her car when she heard one of the men shout, "The chamber's been breached! Someone's been through the files!" Sarah abandoned stealth and ran. Behind her, flashlight beams swept the grounds as the men burst from the building. She reached her car and fumbled with the keys, her pregnant belly making it awkward to slide behind the wheel. The engine turned over, just as she heard running footsteps approaching. Sarah floored the accelerator, gravel spraying behind her as she raced down the dirt road. In her rearview mirror, she saw flames beginning to lick at the church windows. The files in her backpack felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. She had evidence of decades of disappearances, but nowhere safe to take it. And now they knew someone had found their secret. The sheriff's cruiser sat in her driveway like a predator waiting to strike. Maya pressed herself against the kitchen window, watching Deputy Collins emerge from the passenger seat while Sheriff Brennan took his time getting out, his movements deliberate and unhurried. She recognized the intimidation tactic. She'd seen enough cops in her life to know when they were trying to rattle someone. Her hands instinctively moved to her belly as the baby kicked, responding to her elevated heart rate. The files were still spread across the hidden chamber below, along with the photographs and evidence boxes she'd been cataloguing since dawn. 3 trips up and down those stone steps had left her exhausted, but she'd managed to document everything with her phone before the law arrived at her door. The knock came firm and authoritative. Maya smoothed her oversized sweater and opened the door with what she hoped looked like innocent curiosity rather than barely controlled panic. "Morning, Miss Chen," Sheriff Brennan said, touching the brim of his hat. His smile never reached his eyes. "Hope you don't mind us stopping by. We had some concerns about your safety out here." "Safety?" Maya stepped aside to let them enter, though every instinct screamed against it. "I'm fine. Thank you for asking." Deputy Collins was already scanning the interior, his gaze lingering on the construction supplies and the tools scattered near the altar area. "Lot of work ahead of you," he commented. "This old place has quite a history." "So I'm learning," Maya said carefully. "The previous owners left it in rough shape, but it has good bones." Brennan chuckled, but the sound held no warmth. "Good bones, yes. Sometimes old buildings hold on to things longer than they should, though. Memories, secrets." He paused near the altar, running his hand along the stone edge where Maya had pried up the hidden entrance just hours before. You haven't found anything unusual during your renovations, have you? The question hung in the air like smoke. Maya felt sweat gathering between her shoulder blades despite the morning chill. Unusual how? Old documents, perhaps. Items left behind by previous occupants. Collins had wandered closer to the area where the entrance lay concealed beneath a carefully repositioned stone slab. Churches sometimes become repositories for things people want to keep hidden. Maya's mind raced. They knew. Somehow they knew about the chamber, or at least suspected she'd found something. But how much did they actually know about what was down there? "I found some old hymnals and a few pieces of church furniture," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Nothing particularly interesting." "Why? Is there something specific you're looking for?" Brennan and Collins exchanged a glance that lasted a fraction too long. "We've had reports of trespassers in this area," Brennan said finally. "Vandals, mostly. Kids looking for thrills. But sometimes people come looking for things that don't belong to them. Things from the past that should stay buried," Collins added, his tone carrying an unmistakable warning. Maya felt the baby shift restlessly inside her, picking up on her stress. She placed a protective hand on her belly, the gesture unconscious, but not lost on either man. Brennan's expression softened slightly, but his eyes remained calculating. "You're quite far along," he observed. "When are you due?" 6 weeks, Maya answered honestly, hoping the truth would make everything else sound more credible. "That's quite a project to take on so close to delivery," Collins said. "Most expectant mothers would be focused on nurseries and baby preparations, not renovating abandoned churches." The criticism in his voice made Maya's jaw tighten. "Most expectant mothers have more options than I do." Something flickered across Brennan's face, sympathy perhaps, or calculation. "We're not here to judge your choices, Miss Chen. We're here because we care about this community's safety. Sometimes people stumble into situations that are bigger than they realize, dangerous situations." The threat was clear now, wrapped in concern but unmistakably present. Maya met his gaze directly, drawing on reserves of courage she wasn't sure she possessed. "I appreciate your concern, Sheriff, but I'm just trying to build a home for my baby. I'm not looking for trouble." "Good," Brennan said, moving toward the door, "because trouble has a way of finding people who go looking in places they shouldn't." He paused at the threshold, turning back with that cold smile. "You have our number if you need anything, or if you find anything that might be of interest to local law enforcement." After they left, Maya waited a full 10 minutes before returning to the altar. Her hands shook as she moved the stone slab aside and descended into the chamber. The files seemed to watch her from their boxes, evidence of crimes that powerful people had worked very hard to keep buried. She had stumbled into something far more dangerous than she'd imagined, but backing down now felt impossible. These victims deserved justice, and their families deserved answers, even if seeking the truth put her and her unborn child directly in harm's way. The rain had started again, drumming against the stained glass windows with an intensity that made Sarah's nerves jump. She'd been sitting in the hidden chamber for 3 hours now, methodically photographing every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence with her phone. Her battery was down to 15%, but she couldn't stop. Not when she was so close to understanding what she'd stumbled into. The pattern was becoming clearer with each file she examined. The missing persons weren't random. They were all people who'd gotten too close to something. A journalist investigating municipal contracts, a city planner who'd questioned zoning decisions, a homeless advocate who'd been documenting the disappearances of people living on the streets. People like her, people society barely noticed when they vanished. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened another manila folder. Inside was a photograph of a young woman, maybe 25, with kind eyes and a social worker's badge clipped to her jacket. The accompanying report was written in the same careful handwriting she'd seen throughout the other files, and Becca Martinez, age 26, Social Services Department, investigating allegations of misconduct in city housing programs. Last seen October 15, 2019. Subject became increasingly vocal about irregularities in low-income housing contracts, recommended for intervention. The baby kicked hard against Sarah's ribs, as if sensing her distress. She pressed a hand to her stomach, whispering soft reassurances she didn't feel. The deeper she dug into these files, the more she understood that whoever had been operating out of this church hadn't just been documenting disappearances, they'd been orchestrating them. A loose photograph slipped from the folder and fluttered to the stone floor. Sarah bent awkwardly to retrieve it, her pregnant belly making the movement clumsy. The image made her blood run cold. It was taken from a distance, but she could clearly see Rebecca Martinez standing outside a municipal building, talking to an older man in an expensive suit. Someone had drawn a red circle around both figures and written a date in the margin. October 14th, 2019, one day before Rebecca's disappearance. Sarah squinted at the photograph, holding it closer to the dim light. The man's face was partially obscured by shadow, but something about his posture, the cut of his jacket, seemed familiar. She'd seen him before, but where? The answer came to her like a physical blow. The real estate agent who'd sold her the church, Marcus Whitfield. He'd been younger in the photograph, but those sharp shoulders, that particular way he held his head, it was definitely him. Her phone buzzed with a text message, the sound unnaturally loud in the confined space. Sarah nearly dropped the photograph as she fumbled for the device. "How are you settling in? Hope you're finding everything you need. Best, Marcus Whitfield." Sarah stared at the message, her heart hammering. The timestamp showed he'd sent it 20 minutes ago, 20 minutes after she'd entered the hidden chamber. The coincidence felt like ice water in her veins. She forced herself to think rationally. It could be innocent, a follow-up from a real estate agent checking on his client. But the timing, combined with his presence in a photograph connected to a missing woman, made every instinct scream danger. Another text arrived, "And I'm in the neighborhood. Mind if I stop by to see how the renovations are going?" Sarah's breath caught. She looked around the chamber frantically, taking in the scattered files, the evidence of her investigation spread across the stone floor. If Whitfield came inside, if he discovered what she'd found? Moving as quickly as her pregnancy allowed, she began gathering the documents, trying to return them to some semblance of their original organization. Her phone buzzed again. "I just pulled up outside. Saw your car in the lot." Panic flooded her system. She shoved the most incriminating files into her jacket, wincing as the papers crinkled against her belly. The chamber door seemed impossibly heavy as she struggled to close it, her hands shaking so badly she could barely manipulate the latch. The main door of the church opened with its characteristic groan just as Sarah emerged from behind the altar. She grabbed a paint roller from her supplies and tried to look casual, though her heart was beating so hard she was sure it must be visible through her jacket. "Sarah," Whitfield's voice echoed through the nave, friendly and warm. "Hope you don't mind the impromptu visit." She turned to face him, forcing a smile. Up close, there was no doubt. This was the man from the photograph, the man who'd been watching Rebecca Martinez the day before she disappeared. "Of course not," Sarah managed, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. "Just working on some interior painting." Whitfield's eyes swept the church, taking in every detail. When his gaze lingered on the altar area, Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. His smile never wavered, but there was something calculating in his expression, something that hadn't been there during their previous meetings. "Wonderful," he said, stepping closer. "Mind if I take a look around? I love seeing how clients make these old spaces their own." The manila folders felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds in Sarah's trembling hands. 3 days had passed since her discovery, 3 sleepless nights spent poring over documents that painted a picture so horrifying she could barely comprehend it. The hidden chamber had revealed more than missing persons cases. It contained evidence of systematic cover-ups stretching back 40 years. Father Michael Kowalski hadn't been working alone. The pregnancy kicked against her ribs as she spread the photographs across the dusty altar, her makeshift workspace. Each image showed the same thing, Young women, all between 16 and 25, all pregnant, all with the same haunted look in their eyes that Sarah recognized from her own mirror. The dates on the back ranged from 1983 to just 18 months ago. A manila envelope marked Sanctuary Protocol contained handwritten notes in Father Kowalski's careful script. Sarah's blood ran cold as she read the clinical descriptions of intake procedures and placement arrangements. The church hadn't been abandoned. It had been a way station, a place where desperate pregnant women were processed like inventory. The front door's rusty hinges groaned, and Sarah's heart nearly stopped. She hadn't heard a car approach. Moving quickly, she gathered the most damning documents and stuffed them into her backpack, then crept toward the side window. A black sedan sat in her makeshift driveway, its engine still ticking as it cooled. Two men in dark suits emerged, their movements deliberate and practiced. The taller one spoke into a radio while scanning the property. Sarah recognized the type, not police but something worse. Private security, maybe corporate cleaners. The kind of people who made problems disappear. She slipped through the vestry door and into the small office space behind the altar, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The baby responded to her stress, rolling and kicking as if sensing danger. Through the thin wall, she could hear the men's footsteps echoing in the nave. "Place has been empty for 2 years," the first voice said. "Neighbors reported seeing lights. Could be squatters," replied the second, deeper voice. "Or someone else found Kowalski's stash." Sarah pressed her back against the wall, one hand protectively covering her belly. They knew about the hidden chamber. Of course they did. They'd probably helped create it. "Check the basement," the deep voice continued. "If someone's been down there, we need to know what they saw." The sound of their footsteps moved toward the altar, and Sarah knew she had minutes before they discovered the displaced stone and the entrance to the chamber below. She eased open the office's rear window, grateful for the months of manual labor that had strengthened her arms despite her pregnancy. The drop to the ground was farther than expected, and she landed hard, biting back a cry of pain as her knees buckled. The baby protested with a series of sharp kicks, but she forced herself to move, staying low as she made her way toward the tree line behind the church. Her truck sat exposed in the front drive, blocked by their sedan. Even if she could reach it, they'd hear the engine immediately. The nearest neighbor was half a mile through dense woods, too far in her condition. She needed somewhere to hide and think. The old cemetery stretched out before her, its weathered headstones offering limited cover but familiar terrain. Sarah had spent weeks here, clearing overgrowth and reading the names of people who'd found their final rest in consecrated ground. Now she wove between the markers like a ghost herself, heading for the maintenance shed at the far end of the property. Behind her she heard shouting. They'd found the chamber. The shed's door hung open, its lock long since rusted away. Inside, among the abandoned groundskeeping tools, Sarah found a relatively clean corner and sank down, trying to control her ragged breathing. The documents in her backpack felt like they were burning through the fabric. Through a gap in the wooden walls, she watched the two men emerge from the church. The taller one was speaking rapidly into his radio, while the other circled her truck, peering through the windows. They moved with the efficiency of people who'd done this before, people for whom missing pregnant women were just another day at the office. The radio crackled, and though she couldn't make out the words, the tone was clear: more people were coming. Sarah's mind raced through her options. The bus station in town was 12 miles away. The police might be compromised. Several of the documents bore official letterhead from the county sheriff's department. The women's shelter where she'd stayed briefly had a 24-hour crisis line, but trusting anyone now felt impossible. The men returned to their car, but instead of leaving, they parked across the drive and settled in to wait. One lit a cigarette while the other made another radio call. They weren't going anywhere. As darkness began to fall, Sarah realized with growing terror that she was trapped. Whatever conspiracy had operated from this supposedly sacred ground was still very much alive, and now she was next on their list. The sheriff's cruiser sat in her driveway like a vulture, chrome gleaming under the pale morning sun. Sarah pressed herself against the kitchen window, watching Deputy Martinez lean against the hood, his radio crackling with static. He'd been there for 20 minutes, just waiting. Her hands trembled as she clutched the burner phone she'd bought the night before. The number for the FBI field office in Sacramento glowed on the cracked screen, but her thumb hovered over the call button. Once she made this call, there would be no going back. No pretending she'd never found that chamber. No quiet life raising her baby in the converted church. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if sensing her distress. Sarah winced, placing a protective hand over her belly. "I know, little one. Mama's scared too." Martinez pushed off from the cruiser and started walking toward her front door. Sarah's pulse spiked. She couldn't let him inside. Not with the evidence still hidden upstairs, and definitely not with her laptop containing the photos she'd taken. She grabbed her jacket and stepped outside before he could knock. "Morning, Deputy." She forced her voice to stay steady. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Martinez's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Ms. Chen, mind if we have a chat? Sheriff's got some questions about your property." "What kind of questions?" "Oh, just routine stuff. You know how it is with old buildings. Sometimes we get reports of disturbances, people hearing things, seeing lights where there shouldn't be any." His gaze drifted toward the church. "Historical Society's been asking questions too. Seems your building's got quite a past." Sarah's mouth went dry. "I haven't heard anything unusual." "That's good to hear." Martinez stepped closer, and Sarah caught the scent of coffee and aftershave. "Thing is, we've had some concerns about structural integrity. Old churches, they can be dangerous. Hidden rooms, unstable foundations. We'd hate for you or your baby to get hurt." The words hit like ice water. He knew. Somehow, they knew she'd found the chamber. "I appreciate the concern," Sarah managed, "but I had the building inspected before I bought it." "Course you did. But inspections don't catch everything, do they?" Martinez pulled out a folded paper from his jacket. "This here's a safety inspection order. Gives us the right to examine the premises for potential hazards. Wouldn't want anything happening to Millbrook's newest resident." Sarah stared at the official-looking document, her vision blurring at the edges. The paper could be fake. Martinez could have printed it himself, but it didn't matter. They had badges and guns and the weight of authority behind them. She had pregnancy hormones and a desperate hope that someone would believe her story. "I'd prefer to have my lawyer present," she said. Martinez chuckled. "Your lawyer? Ma'am, this isn't a criminal matter. This is about keeping you safe. Besides, what kind of lawyer you gonna find in Millbrook on a Wednesday morning?" A radio squawked from the cruiser, and Sarah caught fragments of the transmission. Additional units. Back entrance covered. They weren't taking any chances. The deputy was right about one thing. She had no lawyer, no allies, no one who would take her word over Sheriff Coleman's. But she had something they didn't know about. The photos she'd uploaded to a cloud storage account the night before. Insurance, in case something happened to her. "Of course," she said, surprising herself with how calm she sounded. "You're just doing your job. But would you mind if I grabbed my purse and locked up first? Pregnancy brain. I left the stove on." Martinez nodded, but his hand drifted toward his radio. "Make it quick. And Miss Chen, don't make any phone calls while you're in there. Official business requires full attention." Sarah walked back toward the house on unsteady legs. Behind her, she heard Martinez speaking quietly into his radio. "Subject is compliant. Beginning interior sweep in 2 minutes." Inside, she had maybe 90 seconds before they lost patience. Sarah grabbed her purse and the burner phone, then rushed upstairs to where she'd hidden the most damning pieces of evidence. The files went into a garbage bag, along with her laptop. Her hands shook as she lowered the bag out her bedroom window into the overgrown bushes below. When she came back outside, Martinez was joined by 2 more deputies. They'd parked around back, just as she'd overheard on the radio. "Ready when you are," she called out, hoping her voice carried better than her courage. As they walked toward the church, Sarah felt the weight of 30 years of secrets pressing down on her shoulders. The missing people in those files had families who deserved answers. The conspiracy that had buried their cases needed to see daylight. But first, she needed to survive whatever Sheriff Coleman had planned for her. The church doors loomed ahead, promising sanctuary that Sarah knew was nothing but an illusion. The floorboards groaned under Sarah's weight as she paced the main sanctuary, her phone pressed against her ear. Detective Martinez had been understanding when she'd called, but his tone carried that careful neutrality cops used when they thought someone might be losing their grip on reality. "I'll send someone by tomorrow morning to take a look," he'd promised. But Sarah heard the subtext. Tomorrow felt like a lifetime away, when every shadow in the church seemed to shift with malevolent purpose. She'd spent the afternoon systematically going through more of the files, her initial shock giving way to methodical horror. The missing persons cases spanned 3 decades, with gaps that suggested either periods of inactivity or simply missing documentation. What chilled her most was the pattern. The victims were all society's forgotten: runaways, addicts, sex workers, the homeless, people whose disappearances wouldn't generate headlines or sustained police investigations. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if sensing her distress. Sarah placed a protective hand over her belly, whispering reassurances that felt hollow in the cavernous space. She'd come here seeking sanctuary, but instead had uncovered what felt like the mouth of hell itself. A sound from outside made her freeze mid-step. Car doors slamming, voices carrying across the empty lot. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she recognized one of them, the gravelly tone of the man who'd questioned Mrs. Chen about her. Moving as quietly as her pregnant body would allow, Sarah crept to one of the boarded windows and peered through a gap between the planks. 3 figures stood near a dark sedan, their faces obscured in the twilight but their body language radiating purpose and authority. Not the casual stance of curious neighbors or even beat cops responding to her call. "Sure she's been staying here?" The gravelly voice drifted across the evening air. Chen woman was certain, said she's been coming and going for days. A second voice, younger but equally cold. Sarah's mind raced. They weren't here by coincidence. Someone had been watching, waiting, and now they'd come calling. The hidden chamber suddenly felt less like a discovery and more like a trap she'd walked into willingly. She backed away from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. The smart thing would be to call 911, but what if these men were connected to whatever conspiracy the files documented? The evidence suggested corruption that reached into official channels. Trust the wrong person, and she might disappear just like all those others whose faces stared up at her from decades-old photographs. The front door handle rattled, sending a spike of adrenaline through Sarah's system. She'd locked it, but locks were small comfort against determined intruders. Moving with desperate urgency, she gathered the most damning files from where she'd left them, scattered across a pew, stuffing them into an old canvas bag she'd been using to carry supplies. Footsteps circled the building's perimeter. They were looking for another way in, testing windows and doors with professional thoroughness. Sarah knew it was only a matter of time before they found the loose board she'd used to first enter the church. The chamber. It was her only option. Sarah descended into the hidden space as quietly as possible, pulling the altar stone back into place above her head. The darkness enveloped her like a suffocating blanket, but she didn't dare risk the flashlight's beam. Instead, she felt her way to the far corner, where she'd noticed a second passage earlier, little more than a crawl space that might lead to the church's foundation or beyond. Above her, the sound of splintering wood announced their entry. Heavy footsteps crossed the sanctuary floor, moving with the confidence of men who'd done this before. Sarah pressed herself deeper into the shadows, one hand clutching the bag of evidence, the other protecting her unborn child. "Place has been cleaned out recently," one voice observed, "but someone's definitely been living here. Check everything. If those files are here, we need them." Sarah's breath caught. They knew about the files. This wasn't a fishing expedition, it was a recovery mission, which meant someone in authority knew exactly what she'd found and was willing to send men to retrieve it. The conspiracy wasn't historical, it was active, ongoing, and she'd stumbled directly into its path. A beam of light penetrated the chamber as they discovered the hidden entrance. Sarah squeezed herself into the narrow passage, ignoring the way rough stones scraped against her skin. The baby protested the cramped position with sharp kicks, but she had no choice. The voices grew muffled as she crawled deeper into darkness, following a tunnel that seemed to lead away from the church's foundation. Behind her, she could hear them moving through the chamber, their discovery of its contents marked by sharp exclamations and the rustle of disturbed papers. She had to keep moving. Whatever this passage led to, it was her only chance of escape. The basement of the church had become Sarah's war room. File boxes created a maze around the furnace, their contents spread across every available surface like pieces of a massive, horrifying puzzle. She'd been down here for 3 days straight, surviving on crackers and determination, her growing belly making it harder to maneuver between the stacks of evidence. Detective Morrison's business card lay on the workbench beside her, worn from handling. She'd picked it up a dozen times, her finger hovering over her phone's keypad, but something always stopped her. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when she'd seen what happened to people who asked too many questions about Blackwood. A loose floorboard creaked overhead. Sarah froze, listening. The church had its own language of sounds by now. The settling timber, the wind through broken windows, mice in the walls. This was different, deliberate. She killed the flashlight and crept toward the stairs, heart hammering against her ribs. Through the gap beneath the basement door, she could see a thin beam of light sweeping across the sanctuary floor. Someone was inside. Sarah's hand instinctively went to her belly. The baby kicked, as if sensing her fear. She thought of the missing persons files, the photographs of people who'd simply vanished after getting too close to the truth. Was this how it ended for them too? Cornered in the dark with nowhere to run? The footsteps moved closer to the altar. Sarah pressed herself against the wall beside the stairs, straining to hear. One person moving carefully, but not trying to be silent. That could be good or very bad. Sarah Chen? The voice was female, unfamiliar. I know you're here. I saw the light from the road. Sarah said nothing. It could be a trap. Blackwood had resources, connections. They could send anyone. My name is Janet Morse. My daughter Rebecca disappeared 7 years ago. A pause. Detective Morrison told me you might have found something. Sarah's pulse quickened. Morrison had given her up, but the pain in the woman's voice sounded genuine, raw with years of unanswered questions. I'm not going to hurt you, Janet continued. I just need to know what happened to her. Against every instinct screaming at her to stay hidden, Sarah slowly climbed the stairs and cracked open the door. A woman in her 50s stood near the altar, flashlight pointed at the floor. Her face was gaunt, aged beyond her years by grief. You're taking a big risk coming here, Sarah said, stepping into the sanctuary. Janet turned, her eyes immediately going to Sarah's pregnant belly. So are you. Morrison said you've been living here, going through old case files. What exactly did Morrison tell you? That someone had found evidence related to missing persons cases, that there might finally be answers. Janet's voice broke slightly. Rebecca was 19. She was asking questions about the Riverside Development Project where they built those luxury condos. She thought something wasn't right about how they'd gotten the permits, the environmental clearances. Sarah felt the familiar chill of recognition. Blackwood Development. You know them? I'm learning. Sarah gestured toward the basement door. Your daughter isn't the only one who disappeared after investigating them. Janet followed her downstairs, gasping when she saw the scope of the files. Dear God! How many are there? 43 cases over 22 years. All people who were looking into Blackwood's projects, asking about permits, environmental violations, suspicious deaths at construction sites. Sarah pulled Rebecca's file from a stack. Your daughter was thorough. She'd documented everything. Janet's hands trembled as she opened the folder. Photos of her young daughter stared back, along with pages of handwritten notes about discrepancies. in the Riverside project approval process. She'd found evidence that Blackwood was dumping toxic waste illegally, Janet whispered, falsifying environmental impact reports. She was going to take it to the EPA. Instead, she vanished. The police said she probably just left town. 19-year-olds do that sometimes, but Rebecca wouldn't have done that. She was passionate about this work. She wouldn't have just walked away. Sarah spread out a map she'd created, marking locations connected to each disappearance. Look at the pattern. Every missing person was investigating a different Blackwood project, but they all connect to the same central network of officials. City planners, environmental inspectors, zoning commissioners. Janet studied the map, her finger tracing connections between cases. They've been doing this for decades, and getting away with it because they have people in the right positions to make problems disappear. Sarah's baby kicked hard, making her wince. The question is what to do with this information. We take it to the FBI, the state attorney general, someone outside the local system. And if Blackwood finds out we're planning to expose them? Sarah touched her belly. These people don't leave witnesses. Janet met her eyes. Then we'd better be very careful about how we do this. The wind picked up outside, rattling the church's broken windows. In the distance, a car engine hummed past on the road. Sarah wondered if it was just another late-night traveler or if their time was already running out. The morning light filtered through the stained glass windows as Sarah carefully descended into the hidden chamber, her movements deliberate despite the growing urgency. Detective Morrison had left an hour ago, promising to return with backup, but something in his eyes had made her uneasy. She'd caught him glancing at his phone too often, his jaw tight with an emotion she couldn't quite read. Now, alone with the damning evidence scattered across the makeshift table, she worked methodically through the remaining boxes. The baby stirred restlessly, as if sensing her mounting anxiety. Each file she opened revealed another layer of corruption, another name that connected back to the same shadowy network that had been operating for decades. A photograph slipped from between two manila folders, landing face up on the concrete floor. Sarah's blood turned to ice. The image showed a younger Detective Morrison shaking hands with Councilman Bradley outside the very church she now owned. The timestamp read 15 years ago, right around the time several of the disappearances had occurred. Her phone buzzed with a text message, "Change of plans. Coming alone. Don't trust anyone else. Morrison." The words that should have been reassuring now felt like a death sentence. Sarah's hands trembled as she gathered the most incriminating evidence, stuffing files into a duffel bag she'd brought down from upstairs. She had to get out, had to find somewhere safe to sort through what was real and what was deception. Footsteps echoed from above, too early to be Morrison unless he'd lied about the timing. Sarah killed the battery-powered lamp and pressed herself against the stone wall, listening. The footsteps moved with purpose, not the cautious exploration of someone unfamiliar with the space. Whoever was up there knew exactly where they were going. The secret entrance behind the altar began to creak open. Sarah clutched the duffel bag to her chest and moved deeper into the chamber, toward what looked like another passage she hadn't fully explored. The musty air grew thicker as she felt her way along the wall, her phone's flashlight creating dancing shadows that seemed to mock her predicament. Sarah Martinez? The voice that called down wasn't Morrison's. It was younger, female, with an authority that suggested law enforcement. "This is Agent Chen, FBI. Detective Morrison sent me ahead. It's safe to come out." Every instinct screamed trap. Sarah had learned not to trust easily, and nothing about this situation felt right. She continued moving through the narrow passage, her fingers trailing along rough stone until they found what felt like a door handle. The metal was cold and corroded, but it turned. Behind her, more footsteps descended into the main chamber, and she heard the unmistakable sound of papers being shuffled. They weren't here to protect the evidence. They were here to destroy it. "She's not down here," the female voice called to someone above. "But the files are. Start with the Bradley documents." Sarah pushed through the door and found herself in what appeared to be an old utility tunnel. probably dating back to when the church was first built. The passage stretched in both directions, disappearing into darkness. She chose the direction that seemed to slope upward, hoping it would lead to another exit. The tunnel was barely wide enough for her pregnant body, and she had to move slowly to avoid tripping over debris. Behind her, she could hear voices growing more agitated as they realized some of the evidence was missing. It wouldn't take them long to find the passage she'd used to escape. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Sarah saw a faint outline of light ahead. The tunnel ended at a metal grate that opened into an alley behind the church. She pushed against it desperately, and after several attempts the corroded hinges gave way. She emerged, gasping into the cold morning air, her clothes filthy and her heart racing. The alley was empty except for an old sedan parked near the mouth. As she approached cautiously, the driver's door opened and Detective Morrison stepped out. "Thank God you're safe," he said, but his relief looked forced. "Agent Chen told me what happened. We need to get you somewhere secure while we sort this out." Sarah backed away, the duffel bag clutched protectively against her belly. "There is no Agent Chen, is there?" Morrison's expression hardened. "Sarah, you're in serious danger. People have been looking for those files for a very long time. The only way to keep you and your baby safe is to cooperate." "Cooperate with whom?" she demanded. "The same people who made those files necessary in the first place?" A second car pulled into the alley, blocking her exit route. Sarah realized with growing horror that she'd fled one trap only to walk directly into another. The baby kicked hard, as if urging her to run, but there was nowhere left to go. Morrison pulled out his handcuffs, his face apologetic but determined. "I'm sorry, Sarah, I really am." The rain hammered against the stained glass windows as Sarah crouched behind the wooden pews, her heart pounding so violently she was certain it would give away her position. Detective Morrison's footsteps echoed through the sanctuary, deliberate and measured, like a predator stalking wounded prey. "I know you're in here, Sarah." His voice carried through the darkness, artificially calm. "We need to talk about what you've seen." She pressed her back against the cold stone wall, one hand protectively covering her swollen belly. The baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing the danger that surrounded them. In her other hand, she clutched the manila folder containing copies of the evidence she'd photographed in the hidden chamber. The real files were still down there, but these copies were her insurance policy. "You don't understand the situation you've stumbled into," Morrison continued, his flashlight beam sweeping across the altar. "This is bigger than you, bigger than all of us." Sarah's mind raced through her limited options. The back exit was too far, and she'd heard at least 2 other sets of footsteps outside before Morrison entered alone. They had the church surrounded. Her phone had no signal in the stone building, and even if it did, who could she trust? Morrison wore a badge. He had authority, resources, and apparently decades of practice covering up the truth. 23 families, Detective," she called out, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. 23 people who disappeared, and you made sure no one ever looked too hard for them." Morrison's footsteps stopped. "You think you know what happened here? You think those files tell the whole story?" "I know enough." Sarah shifted carefully, trying to get a better view of his location while staying hidden. "I know about the development deals, the convenient disappearances of anyone who opposed them, the evidence that got lost, the witnesses who suddenly changed their stories." A bitter laugh echoed through the sanctuary. "You know nothing about sacrifice, about the greater good." "The greater good?" Sarah's voice cracked with disbelief. "You destroyed families, erased people from existence." "We saved this town." Morrison's composure finally cracked, his voice rising. "Do you have any idea what this place was like 30 years ago? Dying, rotting, no jobs, no future. Those development projects brought life back to these streets. At what cost?" "At whatever cost was necessary." His footsteps resumed, closer now. A few people who couldn't see the bigger picture. Troublemakers. Activists who would have condemned thousands to poverty for the sake of their precious landmarks and old buildings. Sarah felt sick. In his voice she heard not madness but cold calculation. This wasn't the work of a rogue cop gone bad. This was systematic, planned. How many others were involved? How deep did this conspiracy reach? "The church," she whispered, understanding flooding through her. This was supposed to be torn down too, wasn't it? Another development project. Smart girl. Morrison's beam of light swept dangerously close to her hiding spot. But the project got delayed. The developer died suddenly, natural causes unfortunately, and his heirs weren't interested in continuing his vision. The church sat here, with all our secrets safely buried beneath it, until I bought it. Until you bought it, he confirmed. Bad luck for both of us. Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her pocket, where she'd hidden a small digital recorder. She'd been documenting everything since finding the chamber, a habit born from years of bureaucratic battles with social services. If she didn't survive this, maybe someone would eventually find the recording. You could have just renovated the upper levels, Morrison continued, his tone almost conversational now. Raised your baby in ignorant bliss. We would have made sure nothing ever disturbed your little sanctuary. I couldn't live like that. Not knowing. Knowledge is a luxury, Sarah, one that people in your situation can't afford. The casual cruelty in his words sparked something fierce and protective in her chest. My situation? You mean being poor, being pregnant, being alone? I mean being expendable. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the baby's movements beneath her palm. She thought of all the other victims in those files. Had they felt this same helpless terror in their final moments? Had they known that their lives were being weighed against profit margins and deemed worthless? There's something else you should know, Morrison said, and Sarah heard the subtle shift in his voice that meant he was moving closer. About your baby's father, about why he really left town so suddenly last spring. Sarah's blood turned to ice. What are you talking about? Marcus was asking questions, Sarah. About his sister's disappearance 5 years ago. About why the investigation into her case was closed so quickly. Morrison's footsteps stopped directly on the other side of her pew. We tried to convince him to let sleeping dogs lie, but some people just won't listen to reason. The revelation hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath away. The warehouse district felt like stepping into a graveyard at midnight. Sarah's footsteps echoed against wet concrete as she made her way between towering industrial buildings, their broken windows staring down like hollow eyes. The address Father Miguel had whispered to her before losing consciousness led her here, to this forgotten corner of the city where legitimate businesses feared to tread. Her pregnancy made every step more labored, but adrenaline kept her moving. The manila envelope clutched against her chest contained copies of everything, the photographs, the witness statements, the damning evidence that connected Detective Morrison to decades of disappearances. She'd hidden the originals back at the church, but if something happened to her tonight, at least the truth would survive. The building she sought stood at the end of a dead-end street, its facade unmarked except for a faded number painted above a steel door. No signs, no indication of what business might operate from within. The perfect front for something that preferred to remain invisible. Sarah circled the building once, noting the security cameras positioned at strategic angles and the expensive locks that seemed out of place on such a decrepit structure. Light leaked from high windows on the second floor, and she could hear the distant hum of activity, voices, machinery, the sound of people working late into the night. Finding a fire escape on the building's blind side, she began her careful ascent. Each rung tested her balance as her shifting center of gravity fought against her. The baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing her fear. "Just a little longer," she whispered, pressing a hand to her belly. "We're going to end this." The second-floor window she'd targeted was cracked open slightly, probably for ventilation. Through the gap, she could see into what appeared to be an office space, desks, filing cabinets, and walls covered with maps and photographs. More importantly, she could hear voices clearly now. "The priest is handled," a familiar voice was saying. "Detective Morrison." "But the woman is still a problem. She has copies." "Then we find her," came another voice, older and gravelly. "This operation has survived 40 years by being thorough. We don't leave loose ends." Sarah pressed herself closer to the window, straining to hear every word. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the scope of what she was witnessing became clear. "The church property was supposed to be condemned years ago," Morrison continued. "Someone downtown dropped the ball, let it go to auction. Now we've got a pregnant junkie playing detective in our backyard." "I'm not a junkie," Sarah thought fiercely, but kept silent. "She's more than that," the older voice replied. I pulled her file. Sarah Chen, former journalist for the Tribune, investigated corruption cases before her life fell apart. She knows how to connect dots. The revelation that they knew her background sent ice through her veins. This wasn't random. They'd been watching her, studying her. The danger was worse than she'd imagined. "What about the federal contact?" Morrison asked. "Any movement there?" "Senator Blackwood's people are getting nervous. Too much attention on the missing persons cases. They want the whole thing shut down permanently." Sarah's mind reeled. A senator was involved. The conspiracy reached into the highest levels of government, which explained how it had remained hidden for so long. The missing people from the files weren't random victims. They were threats to something much larger. A chair scraped against the floor inside, and footsteps approached the window. Sarah flattened herself against the fire escape's metal platform, hardly daring to breathe. The window opened wider, and cigarette smoke drifted out into the night air. "We need to accelerate the timeline," the older voice said, now much closer. "Clean up the remaining evidence and relocate operations. This site's been compromised. What about the other locations?" "We keep the upstate facility running. It's isolated enough, and we've got good relationships with the local authorities there. The city operation gets shut down completely." "Other locations, more sites where people were being held, tortured, killed." Sarah thought of the photographs she'd seen, the evidence of systematic murder stretching back decades. How many more victims were out there, waiting for rescue that might never come? The cigarette was flicked out into the darkness, landing near her feet. The window started to close, and the voices became muted again. Sarah waited several minutes before moving, ensuring they'd moved away from the window area. She'd heard enough to know the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Whatever this operation was, her discovery of the hidden chamber had forced them into crisis mode. They would move fast now, covering their tracks and eliminating evidence, including her. The climb down felt longer than the ascent, her muscles shaking from tension and exhaustion. When her feet finally touched solid ground, Sarah allowed herself one moment to catch her breath before beginning the journey back to the church. She had names now, locations, confirmation of federal involvement. The envelope in her jacket felt heavier with the weight of what she'd learned, but she also knew her time was running out. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness as Sarah descended into the hidden chamber one final time. Her hands shook as she gathered the remaining evidence files, knowing that within hours this place would be crawling with federal agents. Detective Morrison had assured her the FBI would arrive by dawn, but something gnawed at her gut, a warning she couldn't ignore. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if sensing her urgency. "I know, little one," she whispered, stuffing the last of the photographs into her backpack. "We're almost done here." A sound from above made her freeze. Footsteps echoed through the church sanctuary, slow and deliberate. Morrison wasn't supposed to return until morning with backup. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she recognized the distinctive tap of expensive leather shoes against the wooden floor. She killed the flashlight instantly, plunging herself into absolute darkness. Her heart hammered so violently she was certain it would give her away. The footsteps paused directly above the altar, and she held her breath until her lungs burned. "I know you're down there, Sarah." The voice that drifted through the floorboards was cultured, refined, and utterly terrifying. She'd never heard it before, but somehow knew exactly who it belonged to. "There's no point in hiding. We need to have a conversation." More footsteps joined the first. At least 3 people, maybe 4. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to remember if she'd replaced the altar stone properly. In the pitch blackness, she felt along the walls until her fingers found the narrow passage she'd discovered days earlier, an old drainage tunnel that seemed to lead toward the cemetery. "Chen," the voice continued, closer now. They'd found the entrance. "I'm afraid Detective Morrison won't be joining us. He's had a rather unfortunate accident on his way home this evening." Sarah's knees nearly buckled. Morrison was dead because of her, because she'd trusted him with the truth about what she'd found. She pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a sob and crawled deeper into the tunnel, praying the passage would hold her weight. Behind her, flashlight beams began to probe the hidden chamber. She heard papers rustling, drawers being yanked open. They were destroying everything, all the evidence of their decades-long conspiracy, all proof of the missing people whose faces had haunted her dreams. The tunnel was barely wide enough for her pregnant body, and every inch forward was agony. Sharp stones cut through her jeans, and the musty air made her gag. But she forced herself to keep moving, driven by pure maternal instinct. Whatever happened to her, she had to protect her unborn child. "Find her," the voice commanded. "She's carrying evidence that could destroy us all, and she's seen too much to let walk away." Sarah's hand touched something cold and metallic. Bars. The tunnel was blocked by an old iron grate. She felt frantically around the edges, and her fingers found rusted hinges. The grate swung outward with a creak that seemed deafening in the enclosed space. She emerged into the cemetery, gasping in the frigid night air. The church loomed behind her, light spilling from its windows for the first time since she'd arrived. Dark sedans were parked along the street, vehicles that definitely didn't belong to Morrison or local police. Sarah's phone had no signal, but she remembered seeing a police substation about 6 blocks away when she'd first explored the neighborhood. If she could reach it, if she could find someone Morrison had trusted with the initial evidence they'd submitted. A flashlight beam swept across the cemetery, and she ducked behind a weathered headstone. Her backpack felt impossibly heavy, but she clutched it tighter. The files inside were the only remaining proof of what these people had done. Without them, dozens of families would never know what happened to their missing loved ones. The beam passed by her hiding spot, and she seized the moment to run. Her pregnant body protested every step, but terror gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. Behind her, shouts erupted as they spotted her fleeing figure. Car engines roared to life. They would catch her easily on the open street, but the neighborhood was a maze of narrow alleys and abandoned buildings. If she could lose them in the urban labyrinth, if she could find somewhere to hide until dawn. A sharp pain shot through her abdomen, and Sarah stumbled. Not now. The baby couldn't come now. She pressed on, ducking into an alley as headlights swept past the entrance. The contractions were irregular, probably just stress, but they served as a stark reminder of what was at stake. She wasn't just running for her own life anymore. She was running for her child's future, for the truth that powerful people would kill to keep buried, for justice that had been denied for far too long. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed off the alley walls, and Sarah realized with growing horror that they'd anticipated her escape route. She was trapped, with nowhere left to run. The basement felt different now, charged with an energy that made Sarah's skin crawl. She descended the wooden steps carefully, one hand gripping the rail, the other pressed protectively against her swollen belly. The baby had been restless all morning, as if sensing the danger that surrounded them. Detective Morrison followed close behind, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "You're sure this is where you found everything?" Sarah nodded, though he probably couldn't see her in the dim light. "The hidden chamber is behind the false wall, past all those filing cabinets." Her voice echoed strangely in the confined space, bouncing off stone walls that had kept their secrets for decades. They reached the bottom, and Morrison swept his beam across the room. Sarah had left everything exactly as she'd found it after her last visit. Boxes of evidence scattered across makeshift tables, photographs pinned to a bulletin board like some detective's obsessive investigation. The sight still made her stomach lurch. "Jesus Christ," Morrison whispered, moving toward the nearest box. How long do you think this has been here? Some of the cases go back 30 years, Sarah said, watching him examine a yellowed police report. Maybe longer. I think Father Mackenzie was collecting evidence of cases that were being buried or mishandled. Morrison picked up a photograph, a young woman with dark hair and hopeful eyes. Sarah recognized her from her own investigation. Maria Santos, disappeared 1987, case closed after 2 weeks with no leads found. Except Father Mackenzie had found leads. He'd found witnesses, evidence, connections that the official investigation had somehow missed or ignored. This is massive, Morrison said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. If even half of this is legitimate. He trailed off, but Sarah knew what he was thinking. Careers would end, people would go to prison. The entire department would be under federal investigation. A sudden sound from upstairs made them both freeze. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, crossing the church's main floor. "Did you tell anyone else about this?" Morrison whispered, his hand moving instinctively to his weapon. Sarah shook her head, fear rising in her throat like bile. "No one. I swear." The footsteps stopped directly overhead, somewhere near the altar. Sarah remembered the loose floorboard she'd discovered, the one that provided access to this hidden chamber. Had she replaced it properly after her last visit? Morrison clicked off his flashlight, plunging them into complete darkness. Sarah's breathing sounded impossibly loud in the silence. She pressed herself against the cold stone wall, feeling the baby shift uncomfortably inside her. More footsteps, different this time, lighter, more careful, a second person. "There's another way out," Sarah breathed, her lips barely moving. She'd explored every inch of this basement during her weeks here, through the coal chute. "It leads to the alley behind the church." Morrison's hand found her arm in the darkness, his grip steady and reassuring. "Can you make it in your condition?" Before she could answer, they heard voices overhead, muffled but unmistakably aggressive. Someone was searching the church, and they weren't being subtle about it. Sarah led Morrison through the darkness, navigating by memory and touch. They passed the filing cabinets full of evidence, the photographs of the missing and the dead, the carefully documented proof of corruption that went straight to the heart of the police department. The coal chute was narrow and steep, designed for deliveries rather than human passage. Morrison went first, testing each rung of the old ladder bolted to the concrete wall. Sarah followed, moving slowly and carefully, her pregnant belly making the climb awkward and terrifying. Halfway up, she heard the basement door slam open. Light flooded the chamber below, and angry voices echoed off the walls. "Find it. Find all of it. And find her." Sarah recognized the voice, though she'd only heard it once before. Captain Reynolds, the man who'd been so dismissive when she'd first tried to report finding the evidence. The man who'd told her to forget what she'd seen, to focus on her pregnancy instead of playing detective. Morrison hauled her up the last few rungs and through the coal chute opening. They emerged into the grey afternoon light of the alley, both breathing hard. Sarah's back ached, and she could feel the baby protesting the sudden activity. "My car's 2 blocks away," Morrison said, scanning the alley for threats. "But first, we need to get you somewhere safe." "They know where I live," Sarah said, reality crashing down on her. "They probably know everything about me. Bank records, medical appointments, everywhere I go." Morrison's jaw tightened. "Then we disappear, both of us, until I can figure out who to trust with this." Behind them, the sounds of destruction echoed from the church basement. They were destroying everything. 30 years of carefully collected evidence, proof of conspiracy and cover-up, the only hope for justice that dozens of families had ever had. But they hadn't found everything. Sarah touched the flash drive in her pocket, the one containing digital copies of the most damning files. "Let's go," Morrison said. They ran. The unmarked van idled outside the church as Maya crouched behind the stone baptismal font, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the stained glass windows, she could see the silhouettes of at least 3 figures moving around the perimeter. Detective Harrison's warning echoed in her mind. They'd found her sanctuary. Her phone buzzed with a text from Harrison. They're coming. Back exit, now. Maya's hands trembled as she gathered the most crucial evidence files, stuffing them into her backpack alongside the hard drive containing Detective Morrison's encrypted records. The baby kicked hard as if sensing her panic, and she pressed a protective hand to her swollen belly. The front door's heavy lock clicked. Moving as quietly as her pregnant body would allow, Maya slipped toward the back of the church. The hidden chamber beneath the altar had been sealed again, but not before she'd photographed every document, every missing person report, every piece of evidence that painted a horrifying picture of systematic corruption reaching into the highest levels of law enforcement. Footsteps echoed through the nave. "She's here somewhere," a gruff voice called out. "Morrison's files are missing from the evidence room. She has everything." Maya recognized the voice. Captain Reynolds, Harrison's superior, the man who'd been stonewalling the investigation from the beginning, now stood in her church, confirming her worst fears about how deep the conspiracy ran. She reached the narrow door leading to the vestry, but her blood ran cold when she heard another voice. "Check the basement." Morrison was thorough. If there's a hiding place, he would have found it and documented it. District Attorney Coleman. Maya's chest tightened. If the DA was involved, who could she trust besides Harrison? How many missing people had been silenced to protect these men's careers and bank accounts? The vestry door creaked as she opened it, the sound abnormally loud in her panicked state. Maya froze, listening for any indication they'd heard, but the men were arguing in hushed tones near the altar. "This was supposed to be contained 20 years ago," Reynolds hissed. "How did Morrison get access to the sealed files? Someone's been helping him. Someone with high clearance." Maya's mind raced. Harrison had said Morrison discovered the conspiracy while investigating a recent missing person case that matched the old pattern. The detective had been building a case in secret, gathering evidence of human trafficking operations protected by corrupt officials. But someone had silenced him before he could expose the truth. Now they wanted to silence her too. She slipped through the vestry and into the small storage room beyond. The back exit was just ahead, but as she reached for the door handle, it turned from the outside. Maya's heart stopped. The door swung open, revealing a tall man in a dark suit. But instead of grabbing her, Detective Harrison stepped inside and quickly closed the door behind him. "Thank God," he whispered. "I circled around back. We have maybe 2 minutes before they figure out you're gone. Harrison, Coleman is here. The district attorney is part of this." His face went grim. "I was afraid of that." Morrison suspected but couldn't prove it. He pulled out his phone. "I've got FBI contacts who've been investigating similar operations in other cities. We need to get you somewhere safe while they move in." Through the walls, they could hear Reynolds barking orders to search every corner of the building. "There's a service road through the cemetery," Harrison said. "My car is parked 2 blocks north. Can you make it?" Maya nodded, though her lower back ached and the baby seemed determined to use her bladder as a punching bag. "What about the evidence? If something happens to me—" Morrison was smart. He had backups. Harrison's eyes were fierce with determination. He knew they'd come for him eventually. "The encrypted drive you found? It's programmed to upload everything to secure servers if it doesn't receive a specific code every 72 hours. He's been dead for 4 days. The revelation hit Maya like a thunderbolt. Morrison had built a dead man's switch into his investigation. Even in death, he was still fighting for justice. "Found something," Reynolds' voice boomed from the main church. "There's a hidden chamber down here, recently opened." "Go," Harrison urged, opening the back door just enough to scan the cemetery. "Coast is clear." Maya stepped out into the cool night air, her breath forming small clouds as she moved between the weathered headstones. Behind her, the church that had promised sanctuary now crawled with the very people she'd been hiding from. But Morrison's ghost was still fighting beside her, and his evidence would soon shatter the conspiracy that had claimed so many lives. She just had to stay alive long enough to see justice served. Her baby deserved to be born into a world where the truth mattered more than power. The morning sun cast long shadows through the stained glass windows As Sarah stood in the main sanctuary, her hand resting on her swollen belly, the church felt different now, cleaner somehow, as if the weight of decades-old secrets had finally been lifted from its walls. Detective Morrison had called an hour ago with the news she'd been waiting for. The last of Harrington's network had been arrested, including 2 more city officials and a federal judge who had been covering their tracks for years. "It's over," she whispered to her unborn daughter, feeling a flutter of movement in response. "We're safe now." The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of testimonies, media attention, and legal proceedings. Sarah had become the reluctant face of the investigation, her story of seeking sanctuary only to uncover a decades-long conspiracy capturing national headlines. But through it all, she'd remained focused on one goal, creating the home she'd originally envisioned. Footsteps echoed from the entrance, and Sarah turned to see Maria approaching with a clipboard and measuring tape. The social worker had become an unexpected ally, helping Sarah navigate the complex process of legally establishing her residence in the former church, while ensuring it would be suitable for raising a child. "The city inspector finished his final walkthrough," Maria announced, a smile spreading across her face. "Everything's been approved. You officially own a legal residence, not just an abandoned building." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. The renovations had been funded partly by a victims' compensation fund and partly by an anonymous benefactor who had come forward after reading her story. The hidden chamber beneath the altar had been properly sealed, but not before a memorial wall was installed bearing the names of all the victims whose cases had finally found justice. "There's something else," Maria continued, her expression growing more serious. "We've had several calls from women in situations similar to yours. Women who need a safe place, who heard about what you've built here." Sarah had been expecting this conversation. The church was large enough for multiple families, and she'd always intended to help others once she was stable, but she hadn't anticipated how quickly word would spread or how desperately the need existed. "How many?" Sarah asked. "Right now, 3 women with children and 2 who are pregnant, all fleeing domestic violence or homelessness. The shelter system is overwhelmed, and traditional transitional housing has waiting lists months long." Sarah walked to one of the windows, looking out at the small garden she'd planted, where the overgrown weeds once stood. She could picture children playing there safely, mothers finding the same peace she'd discovered within these walls. "We'll need to establish proper protocols," she said finally. "Background checks, counseling resources, legal protections. This can't just be informal charity. It needs to be a real program." Maria nodded enthusiastically. "I've already spoken to the state about grants for transitional housing programs. With your story and the public attention, funding shouldn't be difficult to secure. But Sarah, this would be a massive undertaking. Are you sure you're ready for this responsibility?" Before Sarah could answer, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Her blood chilled as she read the message. "You may have stopped us, but others will continue the work. Watch your back." Sarah's hand trembled as she showed the message to Maria, who immediately called Detective Morrison. Within minutes he was on the phone, his voice tight with concern. "We've been monitoring communications, but some supporters are still out there," Morrison explained. "This could be an empty threat, but we're not taking chances. I'm posting an officer outside for the next few weeks." Sarah looked around the sanctuary that had become her sanctuary, feeling a familiar fear creep up her spine. But then her baby kicked hard, and she placed both hands on her belly, remembering everything she'd already survived to get to this moment. "I won't be intimidated," she said firmly. "This place has seen enough darkness. It's time for it to be filled with hope instead." Over the following hours, Sarah worked with Maria and Detective Morrison to establish security protocols and emergency procedures. By evening, they had a preliminary plan for converting the church into a legitimate transitional housing facility, complete with childcare services, job training programs, and legal aid. As the sun set, painting the sanctuary in warm golden hues, Sarah felt her daughter settle peacefully in her womb. She thought about the women who would soon find refuge here, just as she had. The hidden chamber that once held evidence of evil would be replaced by a children's playroom. The altar where darkness had been planned would become a community gathering space. The church bells, newly repaired and installed, chimed the hour. Sarah smiled, placing her hands on her belly one more time. Her daughter would be born into a home built from hope, surrounded by a community of survivors who had found strength in each other. The nightmare was finally over. The real life could begin.